most talk about imperial factors in Russian Revolution, and nobody can predict what it is going to be about because everything in Russia is imperial in some way. But I shall focus on the aspect which everybody recognizes as imperial from the very beginning. And this is ethnicity, nationality politics, nationalism. And we shall start with 1914, and we shall end up in 2017. And I think that in this aspect, the consequences of Russian Revolution are still very much felt in Russia, and on the other hand, not fully understood in Russia and in Europe. A good point of departure is February 1914, when one of the most clever Russian politicians of the time, Pyotr Durnovo, penned a memorandum for the Tsar Nicholas II. He argued that at any cost, Russia should avoid confrontation with Germany, because this confrontation will inevitably lead in 3 or 4 years to socialist revolution in the country which will be losing at that time. He added that the victorious side in this clash of Germany and Russia will experience the revolutionary crisis. So he argued that the victorious power would live through also social revolution within a year after that. Again, correct. A lot of his predictions in this text were absolutely accurate. It is interesting that he devoted very little space to discussion of nationality issue. He mentioned the danger from Ukrainian nationalism. He mentioned the danger, of course, from the Polish nationalism. He mentioned Finns. He mentioned Muslim question. He said that all these issues can be a problem, particularly if we have some foreign influence on that. But he says it's all manageable. Nationality issue is not a real deadly challenge. The real deadly challenge is the social issue. Now, here is a question. Was it a blind spot of Pyotr Durnovo? Was he wrong just in this particular case? My understanding is that he was again quite accurate. If we look at how relationship between peripheral nationalisms and the imperial core was developing during the first 2.5 years of the war, we see that basically all the peripheries remained loyal. However, tensions were growing, and in 1917 we of course have peripheral nationalisms which are much stronger and much more daring than somebody could envisage in 1914. What happened? Here I'm challenging a very widespread myth that the collapse of the Russian Empire was the result of this influence or challenge of peripheral nationalism. It is not accurate. Why these nationalisms were growing in power? Which factors were in fact pumping their muscles so visibly during these years? To understand this, we have to realize that the Great War brought a dramatic change into the system of interaction between four big continental empires on the eastern periphery of Europe. I mean Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, and Russia. In fact, if we look at this macro system of empires, we can see that Russia, for example, has common borders with three of them. The same Austria-Hungary. Other two with at least two. These borders were moving sometimes dramatically, unlike in Western Europe. And what is even more important, there was a common perception that the potential for further moves is there. Three of these empires had, so to say, a common skeleton in the locker, which was the partition of the Polish Commonwealth. So during the 19th century, whether they were participating in the concert of powers or they were in some sort of rivalry and confrontation later during the 19th century, one thing was clear. They were very accurate in playing ethnic separatist cards against each other, because they knew that you cannot play, for example, a Polish card against Romanovs without changing the situation with your own Polish subjects, be it in Prussia, later Germany, or Galicia of the Habsburg monarchy, and so on. We have plenty of groups, not just Poles, who were divided by the borders of these empires. Ukrainians, Romanians, Armenians, not speaking about Jews, and so on and so forth. As soon as these empires entered the big war, they realized that this is the war about survival. That was something very new, because during the whole 19th century, empires were fighting wars after the defeat of Napoleon, not to destroy each other, but to end up at the table of negotiations and settlement. It was the concept. Not anymore. So these empires started to use this double-edged sword of nationalism against each other. We can see various spheres where it is happening. To begin with, prisoners of war camps. In Germany and in Austria, they created separate special camps for Ukrainian prisoners of war, where they were working with them and using heavily subsidized the Union for Liberation of Ukraine to work with these prisoners and to very often insert into them the Ukrainian identity and understanding of their national belonging. On the Russian side, they were working with Slavic prisoners of war coming from the Habsburg monarchy, Czechs, Slovaks. Both sides were preparing these groups to come back to the battle lines, to fight on the other side of the front. There were Ukrainian battalions. There was a famous Czech corps, which at a certain moment became so important in Russian Revolution. We have occupational politics, which were very dramatically changing the meaning of ethnicity, nationality, and the hierarchies of nationalities in the occupied territories. Be it Russian-occupied Galicia, where Ukrainian nationalism was suppressed in favor of Russophilic Ruthenians, or be it Oberost, the military administration of the region which was taken from the Russian Empire after the Gorlice offensive in May 1915. We have a lot of sponsorship to various political organizations across the border. Germans created a assembly of suppressed peoples of the Russian Empire, which was very creative in a certain respect, because we used to think that either Wilson or Lenin at a certain point came up with this concept of self-determination of nations. No, it was the German-sponsored Association of the Suppressed Peoples of Russia. Still, the situation until 1917 was not a situation of rebellion of any of these nationalisms in the imperial periphery. As soon as the February Revolution changed the situation, basically we ended up with the rule of people who were described by Max Weber in his writing as those idiots who don't understand that they exist as political force until they are protected by the monarchy. These idiots destroyed this monarchy, and very soon they faced the situation which they couldn't control. They were engaged in some sort of bargain and negotiation with emerging political forces in the periphery, and these political forces more and more were looking at Germany as a potential new patron, be it Lithuanian Tariba, which was sending telegrams to Berlin asking for a prince, a German Hohenzollern prince, to be a Lithuanian king, the Greek solution, a Bulgarian solution, so to say, be it Georgians who asked Berlin for permission to arm the German prisoners of war based in Tiflis because they could become a decisive force in a very insecure and troubled region at that time. Still, this idea that we can end up with the collapse of three empires was very exotic and unpredictable. So people were looking for the change of a pattern. And then we have the collapse of Germany as well. And that is the moment when basically, by default, these movements ended up with what was not national states, but nationalizing states very often. Very few of them actually managed to survive for long. Because at the center, we have from October 1917, and of course it was a revolution. It was not a coup. Not all revolutions are good. Some revolutions are very bad, but it was a revolution in a sense that it changed everything. First of all, the legitimate center disappeared. Just to give you an understanding how it worked, in 1918, Turkish troops arrived in Caucasus and started negotiations with so-called Transcaucasian Federation, which united politicians of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Azeris had their own view of the situation. They were not afraid of Turks. Georgians and Armenians were very much afraid of Turks with some reason. So when Turks demanded that this federation proclaims independence from Russia, the initial answer was, no, we are loyal to the provisional government in St. Petersburg. There was no provisional government in St. Petersburg for more than half a year by that time. What was going on? They were desperately looking for some potential actor in the center who could have been seen as legitimate. By 1918, 1919, it was very clear that the so-called liberal experiment was very short-lived. Actually, when we think about how it was all developing in 1917, instead of looking at Bolsheviks, it is much more instructive to look at Kerensky, the head of provisional government, and how he was building his personality cult during several months he was in power. And that tells you immediately that this potential for this vozhdism, this authoritarian leadership, was there even before Bolsheviks arrived in power. But of course, Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky were playing this role much better than Kerensky. Now, who were, in terms of nationality, the main enemies of the Bolsheviks? These were Russian nationalists. You have to realize that if we look through the perspective of nationalism at civil war, we have white officers, white movement, all these people who were Russian nationalists fighting against Bolsheviks. And that was the main fight, so to say, of the day. Bolsheviks had all the reasons to see Russian nationalism as the main enemy. Because socially, the bearers, the social base of this nationalism, were the classes which were hostile to Bolshevism. Be it nobility, be it bourgeoisie, be it well-off peasantry, or be it clergy, or be it Cossacks. All these groups become immediate target of Bolshevik terror and the war, the civil war of 1918, 1920. Here we come to one of the most mythologized issues of the history of the Russian Empire. If you do some reading, and you probably would do some reading about nationality issues in Russian Empire, you will start with the book by Andreas Kappeler, Russland als Vielvölkerreich. Fantastic achievement. Nobody would be ever able to write such a book again, because only in 1989 it was possible to summarize all the knowledge available on nationality issue. It's beyond human ability to do it today. What is the problem with this outstanding book? When speaking about nationality issues and about various nationalisms, Kappeler almost omits one, which is Russian. 7 years later, Jeffrey Hosking, inspired by Kappeler, wrote yet another book, Russia, People and Empire, in which he argues that the Russian Empire blocked the development of Russian nation and Russian nation building. And that is basically where most of the people remain today with this belief. In 2015, with my German colleague Stefan Berger from Bochum. We have edited a volume under the title Nationalizing Empires. The main argument there is that Osterhammel, in his masterpiece, Die Verwandlung der Welt, had omitted one type of nation building, which was actually the most important. He focuses on nation building in the peripheral areas. While if we look at Spanish nation, French nation, British nation, German nation, Russian nation, these are all projects which are being implemented by empires. We should understand that it is not nations who had their empires, whatever some people tell you. It was empires who were building nations in their core areas. Russia was not an exception. Russia was engaged in nation building through the 19th century, Russian nation building. This nation building was supposed to unite in one nation three East Slavic peoples, White Russians, Little Russians, or Malorossi, and Great Russians, Velikoros. What we call Russians now would be referred to in the 19th century as Great Russians. Why it is so important? Because at the beginning of the 20th century, the question of which project is going to be successful, this overarching Russian project, Triune Russian project, or Ukrainian nation-building project, was still open. World War I dramatically changed the situation. But not only World War I. Bolsheviks absolutely consciously constructed their nationality politics in full conscious rejection of the project which was at the core of Russian imperial nation building. First of all, they introduced the concept of territorialization and institutionalization of ethnicity, which was not part of the Russian imperial practices, unlike in the Habsburg monarchy. In Habsburg monarchy, you have institutionalization of ethnicity, not territorialization, however. In Russian Empire, there was no separate ethnic national military units, for example, until 1917, when Lavr Kornilov, the commander of the Russian army, ordered the Tsarist general Skoropadsky to organize, to Ukrainize his corps. Skoropadsky objected. Skoropadsky was the descendant of one of the hetmans of Little Russia. And he said, I have seen this, I have been to Kiev, I have seen these Ukrainian nationalists. You should take them seriously, I don't like them at all. He was a good Tsarist general, so he followed the orders. In a year, he became hetman of Ukraine. Germans helped a little bit, of course. What we have in Soviet nationality project, we have the idea that all the territory of the new imperial project, the Soviet Union, consists of national territories. These national territories were much more numerous than we are accustomed to think. There were 10,000 ethnic autonomous territorial units. Union republics, autonomous districts, up to ethnic kolkhozes. So what we have is this territorialization of ethnicity, institutionalization of ethnicity, because the famous fifth paragraph in all personal documents from that time on was the nationality. And what was called nationality was in fact, ethnicity or racial belonging, because it was people could choose between nationality of parents when they were defining their nationality. But the menu of nationalities was changing dramatically. In census of 1926, the first Bolshevik census, the identification as Little Russian was forbidden. That meant that now people had to choose between Russian and Ukrainian. The concept of Little Russianness, which was exactly created to be combined with Russianness as overarching idea, was now eliminated. There were many other developments which we can describe as deconstruction of the nation building processes in the Russian Empire, be it, for example, demographic occupation of certain areas by Cossacks and settlers. Soviet power was sending Russians to the periphery, but it was not peasants as it used to be under the Tsar. Now it was workers and specialists in the towns. And that was absolutely different type of migrations. Why it is so important? Because if we look at contemporary Russia, one of beliefs, naive beliefs, is that the solution for Russian political problem is creation of nation state. Very important thing is that that is part of what was dominant at the perestroika years and the first years of this post-Soviet Russia. Post-Soviet is not in the title. It was post-European. We're coming to it. Nation state as a normative concept. Nation state as a solution to Russian problems. Nation state which fits allegedly Russia very much, because in contemporary Russia we have 8% of ethnic Russian population. It's a very good figure for any nationalizing state. So why it is not going to work? And why understanding the legacy of the revolution is so important in this case? Because contemporary Russia lives on the ruins of the Soviet nationality politics. Ruins are not an empty space. Look at the ruins of Colosseum. They are not an empty space. In contemporary Russia, you have 22 autonomous ethnic republics inherited from the Soviet Union. Andropov was the last Soviet leader who was trying to do something with this legacy. And probably Andropov, as a general secretary of the Communist Party and the former head of KGB, could have collected all these secretaries of the Communist parties of republics, look at them with the eyes of the snake and say, we have decided to abolish ethnic division of the country. And I would like to see somebody who would object him at that moment. But he had even such a plan. But of course, he didn't have enough time to do such experiments, luckily. Now, what it means that nation state is a concept which works in case when you have a group politically mobilized, a nation, which owns the state. Then comes the problem of how they treat minorities. They can treat minorities very well. But the fact that the state is owned by this single politically mobilized group is very important. If you have two or more politically mobilized groups which are territorialized and believe that they are nations, better not do that. Because all the attempts to impose nationalizing state model on them result in bad consequences. There are some former Soviet republics who have already tried. In Russia, the mechanism would be different, but the outcome would be similar. It would be tragic. So, do we have any political concepts which might be a solution? Yes, we have the model of state-nation, which was designed by political scientists to fit this situation with two or more politically mobilized groups in the state. And institutional solutions are going to be very different. But here we come basically to this issue of Russian identity, Russian state, and Russian perception of the future, and how it is linked to the things we were talking about. Certain things are very persistent. They might be not visible for a very long time, and then they suddenly reemerge. In year 1990, which was the last year of the Soviet Union, Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote a pamphlet which was called "How Should We Reorganize Russia?" If you read it carefully, and you should, if you want to understand what was going on in Russia at that time, and what is going on in Russia today, you suddenly see that this old concept of triune Russian nation reemerges. He is saying Baltic republics want to leave the Soviet Union. It's a pity, but let them go. Republics of Caucasus maybe don't want to leave, but we should kick them out. And Central Asian republics also, with the exception of northern Kazakhstan. Why? Because Russian population is in majority there. Ukraine should definitely stay in the Soviet, in the core, which has to survive, with the exception of Galicia. Because by that time they realized that it's not working with Western Ukrainians. Belarus should stay. So when you look at this, suddenly this Russian triune Russian national project reemerges. Now, if you look at the ideological repertoire which is available in Russian society today, practically all possible games have been played. Liberalism was there. There was a unique moment when liberals and westernizers were not only, so to say, ruling the minds and hearts, but had the political power in early 90s with disastrous consequences. It's not about liberalism, it's about the quality of people who represented this thing in Russia at that time. But that is gone. Well, socialism is discredited. Capitalism as a free market is discredited. What is there? One thing is still has a potential, and this thing is Russian nationalism. Russian irredentist nationalism. And that is very important and very dangerous. If you look at the speech which Putin made after the annexation of Crimea, it is very clear that he was trying to mention all possible explanations, from democratic, the will of the people of Crimea, to geopolitical, countering NATO, etc., to this issue of Crimea coming back. Germans know what it means. Irredentist nationalism is a very serious power. The biggest danger with irredentist nationalism is that you can provoke it without the initial impulse from Kremlin. Just think about, for example, an old and very ill man who is ruling the country of Kazakhstan. Nazarbayev is going to die soon. What's going to happen? It's a very serious danger. We have to think about it. We have to prepare ourselves for it. Because the current crisis between Russia and Europe, to a very large extent, is rooted also in these nationality issues and this misunderstanding on the European side and on the Russian side. In the title of the project, which Professor Bloom mentioned, stays post-European Russia in search for her identity. What is meant? And that is a very interesting, and that is my final point, very interesting phenomena which is linked to the things we discussed today. In the early 20th century, some very prominent Russian politicians, Sergei Witte, Pyotr Stolypin, they didn't like each other, as all politicians dislike each other when they compete for the position of a prime minister. Still, they were united in one. And this one idea was that Russia should distance herself from Europe as a source of imminent threat of the big war. And the concept was that Russia should go continental and her future lies not in Europe, but in Eurasia. Now, you will read a lot about contemporary Russian Eurasianists, including Dugin, who became the most popular subject for lazy political scientists in the West, because that is how you immediately get audience, because you tell terrible, horrifying stories about these terrible, horrifying thinkers. They are marginal. They are not important. But what is important is that during the last 3 years, Russian society and Russian elites, for the first time in 3 centuries of history, arrived at the point, at the consensus, that they started to think about their future without being centered on Europe. If you look at all Russian identity formation, with all these Slavophiles and Westernizers, what they are talking about, what they are discussing, they are not discussing whether Russia should go to Europe or not. They are discussing to which Europe Russia should go, either to the Europe of progress and liberalism, Westernizers, or to Europe of conservatism and holy miracles as Slavophiles, but it is still very, very centered on Europe. For the first time, we arrived today in a situation when there is a consensus in the society that the European agenda for Russia, for Russian nation, is exhausted. There is no positive agenda anymore. Because all this talk about Europe from Vladivostok to Lisbon is over. Now, what is more important, for the first time in our history, two peripheries are talking to each other. Europe was never so deprived of subjecthood as geopolitical power before. And Russia is weaker than it used to be for many centuries. So two peripheries, two weak peripheries, are talking to each other. And if they can talk productively, they have to reformulate their expectations and the mode of their talk. Because for Russian identity, Europe was always central, and I think that that was very negative. But Russia was also very important for Europe, and still remains. I would strongly recommend you to read a book by Norwegian political scientist and IR specialist Ivar Neumann, Uses of the Other, Eastern European Identity Formation, where he describes two roles in which Russia functioned in European identity discourse. The first role is barbarian at the gate. I don't have to explain it because it is here. Russia is a barbarian at the gate at the moment. But there was the second role, the role of eternal apprentice. And the problem is with this role that for the first time the apprentice is gone, not because he completed the course, simply because he doesn't want to be the member of the guild anymore. And we have to find new mode of talking to each other. So Russian identity formation, Russian building of Russian new project, future project, is now an open matter. We are at the moment of a very intensive and interesting debate in Russia. How we understand the Russian nation, how the state should be shaped, and all this stuff. But what is for sure, Eurocentrism is over. So that is why post-European Russia appears in the title. I'll finish with that. Thank you very much. I'm ready to answer questions.
Yeah, the floor is open for questions. We can, you have to do this in English, actually, or in Russian, if you like.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Miller, for this very interesting talk. You mentioned Sergei Witte and that he was united with Pyotr Stolypin in his non-European orientation, but one could challenge that statement and say that, for example, what Witte did with his with the introduction of Russia into the gold standard was exactly to attach the ruble to the powerful Western currencies of the West, and also to actually make the Russian economy a very valuable destination for French investment. So Russian banks became proxies for French banks like BNP Paribas to invest in China or Persia. So how does that go along with what you just said? Yeah, so this would be my question.
Okay, so
one by one, or should we?
we start because the auditory has to think about questions.
Okay, okay,
we start
okay.
with answering, and then if it's needed, we correct.
When I'm speaking about Vite and Stolypin being united in their idea that Russia should withdraw from Europe, that does not mean at all that they were thinking about how to get rid of all the legacy of Europeanness. And when I'm speaking today about this post-European Russia, I'm not trying to say that, and since tomorrow we are going to dress ourselves in kimono, although that might help with identity formation. What is important is that Eurocentrism is over. And for Vita, it was not Eurocentric vision. They were thinking about Russia as the second big continental scale empire, which is going to compete with United States in Pacific. It turned out that it's going to be another big continental empire, not Russia, but it's going to happen anyway. So, being not centered on Europe does not mean neglecting what you can borrow from Europe. That does not mean that, for example, contemporary Russia is not going to trade with Europe in whatever case it is possible. The more, the better. But it is not about this vision of Russia which is becoming part of. That is very important. And both Vite and Stolypin, we have texts. That is something which can easily be proven, how they were thinking about it. That Russia should not, it doesn't fit into Europe, and it should start thinking about her future as a self-sufficient entity. Last year we had a kind of a closed behind the doors seminar where we were discussing what's going on and how we can at least minimize the damage with some Europeans, some Americans, and some Chinese. And one of these Chinese guys listened to all these discussions we had, typical discussions, Russia, Europe, Russia, Americans. And he said, I don't understand you. Have you ever looked at the map, you Russians? Why you are all thinking about your country as something which is in existential threat? You can destroy all the world. Why? What kind of existential threat you have? Just relax, stop hysteria, and start long-term projects of transforming your country. That is the Chinese approach. Very healthy.
And looking around, yeah, Mihail and Raphael, I've seen two. Maybe you start, Mihail, then maybe now Colette a bit.
Hello, my name is Mihail Wager. I'm from the sociology department. Thank you for a very interesting talk. My question is about the first part of your talk and the early years of this, or the years prior to World War I, and this modernizing project of the, so nationalizing project of the Romanov Empire. My question is about, so I remember one of your contributions, you were saying this very interesting story of the Russian bandit. So this core of Russian Black Hundreds that existed in what is nowadays Western Ukraine, Volyn region, and you were actually saying, if I remember it correctly, that this was actually the core constituency of Russian nationalism in terms of members of Black Hundreds, of Russian Black Hundreds. And I was thinking if you could tell us more, was that strategic? Was that something that was more or less part of a plan, or was it simply due to the interaction with the ethnic groups on the ground?
Okay, so generally, if we look at the period from 1906, when for the first time there was an opening for creation of political parties in Russia. Political parties before 1906 do not exist. Now, when we have political parties, one of these growing political orientations is, how to put it, very anti-revolutionary, very monarchistic, Russian nationalism, which was called Black Hundred, usually in literature associated with Jewish pogroms, which was not their main occupation. And indeed, the biggest organization of these Black Hundreds, Союз Русского Народа, existed in Volhynia, which was the most western part of the Romanov Empire at that time, while Galicia is under the Habsburg rule. So, what is the particular situation of the region? You have Orthodox peasantry under the patronage of priests, and these priests are, of course, Moscow-oriented, and these priests and peasants are united against two enemies. One is the Jews, because, well, everybody knows how Jews are harmful. And second is the Poles, because Poles are the landlords. When the Tsar is gone, and this region finds itself in Poland, the situation transforms. People are the same. But something happened to these people, several things. They still are very anti-Semitic, profoundly anti-Semitic, that is clear. They are profoundly anti-Polish. But there is no St. Petersburg Center, and there is no Russian Orthodox Church anymore. And some people from this region went through these POW camps, 400,000 people, Ukrainian camps. They constituted the core of the Petlura movement. They came back. So not just Orthodox priests, but now those people who later on become the first generation of the own organization of Ukrainian nationalists. And these peasants, their peasant identity in the first decades of the 20th century is very plastic. It can end up in very different locations, simply because they still are experiencing this liquidation of illiteracy. They, for the first time, are transformed from local communities into this national problem. There are many people who were changing their identity and experiencing very dramatic shifts. Mazurians, for example, who were in certain perspectives target of German nationalizing project, in certain perspectives Polish nationalizing project, and depends on who was working with them, you were getting certain results. That is the situation. I would say that, yes, Stolypin, of course, who was behind this movement and supported it very much. He wanted this strong Russian nationalist force against the Poles and against Ukrainian nationalists.
Yeah, that's it.
So, is it on? Okay. Now, so my name is Rafael Mrowczynski, sociologist, Leipzig University. I would like to go back to the question, the first question, and maybe push it a step forward, because my impression was that you talk a lot about national identities and ideas, but there is still also a question of economy. And what would you say, what could be a vision of an alternative economic development for Russia, which is post-Eurocentric? Because my impression is, okay, the Soviet Union had a vision. I mean, we may claim that this vision failed, but they had a vision of an alternative form of how you organize economy, and they claimed it will be better than Western modernization under capitalism. But in case of Russia, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, I would say that there is the tendency was to deliver raw materials to the West, mainly to Europe, and now maybe there is some discussion to include China, but basically in the same way, and to shift the economic ties to China. So is there any discussion about some kind of something that goes beyond that?
There is a lot of such discussion. This discussion does make me, frankly speaking, optimistic. Up to now, I don't see somebody who is convincing in what he suggests, but at least we are finally in the process of this discussion. You have to realize that for approximately 15 years, there was no discussion of what is going on in economy and whether we are doing a good thing. You have to realize that the economic bloc of the government is still very much the legacy of this Gaidar. It is the second generation. And good thing that these guys proved to be now, today, pretty good crisis managers. We all expected that the economy would collapse within 6 months after sanctions or 8 months after sanctions. It turns out that nothing of the sort. And the question is, but how you start to develop from here? And we have several, so to say, schools of thinking about it. My feeling is that in this country, I mean in Russia, unfortunately, the real change is brought by the central power. I mean, you can argue that you need certain decentralization. You need pluralism of these decisions. You cannot, like Denmark, solve your problem of relative backwardness by inventing canned bacon for British breakfast. For Danes, it was enough. After Germany took all the Germans from them, particularly. From Schleswig and Holstein. But you look at this country, it's still very big. You cannot have just one solution. But unfortunately, when you look at what is going on, the ruler is absolutely obsessed with international politics. Well, he is a big player, a big gambler, and he plays a very strong game with a very weak hand. But until recently he didn't bother about economy. It was all just about surviving. Now we have this discussion. I'm not an economist. I'm not going to provide you with some recipes, but we have this discussion. And what I like in this discussion is it is not about this atmosphere of, oh, the train is departing, we have to jump into the last wagon. Nobody knows where the train is departing, not only in Russia, but in Germany and elsewhere. Globalization as we know it is over. It was allegedly the game which was supposed to embrace the whole world, and it was allegedly the game of win-win situation. By now we have already very clear blocks. Nobody is speaking about the united world anymore. TTIP is not about united world, believe me. And the guy who organized one of these blocks expressly says that this block is created in order to fix that we write the rules of the game and not China. And that means that we are in a very different situation. When you think about how Russians perceive this relationship with Europe in the last 25 years, if we talk about it, you remember the stories which maybe were not so important in European press, but they were very important for Russia. When Russia bought 5% of the European, of this Euro, how it was, this French-German company which was building planes. Yeah, Airbus. So they said, okay, we bought 5% of shares. We want our place in the board of directors. You know what happened. Guys, forget about it. The best thing you can do is to sell the shares back, which was done. Then was the story of Opel, when Russians desperately wanted to buy it because they also were buying some know-how. And then, not Germans, but Americans who owned Opel blocked the deal. So what these stories told Russians? That yes, Europe is a source of technology, but it is a source of technology which is based on the principle of eternal apprentice. It is always these technologies which are not of today. So what they're trying to do in Kremlin, they're desperately trying to get some technologies from other sources. I mean, certain colleagues of young Putin are, of course, very instrumental in this, if you understand what I mean. But also joint ventures with Indians, with China, etc., etc. But I mean, Russia, within 25 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, passed with high speed all these stages, which Russian society was passing slowly in the 19th century. The biggest issue today is how to prevent Russia from ending up in what I'm calling Danilevsky moment. Because in 1869, one very weird Russian thinker, Nikolai Danilevsky, wrote a book, Russia and Europe, where he stated that Europe and Russia are enemies. And the collision of two rival civilizations is inevitable. That is why detachment instead of confrontation. How can we stop being Eurocentric, but not proclaiming Europe to be our enemy.
I have, so now we collect. You first, and then I will, okay, then I have to, then you, and maybe I have the chance also to write my question. It's
My name is Yuri Bashikov. I'm a master's student in political economy, Berlin School of Economics and Law. I wanted you to elaborate a little bit on the long-lasting conflicts in the post-Soviet countries. And I mean, like one question maybe, do you think there is a belief in Russian academic discourse and Russian also political elites that there should be some buffer zone between Russia and Europe, two empires, so to say, and or is the idea of this three united Russias, which was like, I don't know, experience some survival in the post-Soviet Russia is stronger? Or, yeah, thank you.
So put it back.
I'm a political science student from Cologne, actually, and I would have a question considering the contemporary understanding of the Russian Revolution, like the 1917 or the two revolutions, for example, maybe. Is it a positive one? Is it actually like in the mind of the public? Like, is there anything planned for next year, or what is planned? So just like the way it's elaborated, I'm thinking of that because I remember the huge parades that there are on the 9th of May since a few years back. So like just in the understanding,
I see.
Is it also being like...
Yeah, I see. Okay.
Maybe you
Yeah, I can answer. I can answer these two questions briefly. Starting with the last one. Don't expect anything compared to the 9th of May. What is defining Russian attitude towards 1917 today is the rejection of revolution as such. I think that Russians finally got to, grew up to the concept of von Stein, who was developing his concept of socially responsible state as the instrument to avoid revolutions. So, no revolutions are positive. There are some certain fragments, of course, in the society which would argue that it is, my opinion is wrong. But, I mean, interesting guys. I have a lot of students who are leftists, but they are not political force, and they're not going to become. Now, buffer zone, Eastern Europe. I cannot, it would take a long time to describe all the spectrum of opinions. I can just tell you what I think about it. 2 points. First of all, Russia should not embark on any revanches in Eastern Europe. There is nothing to gain in Eastern Europe. You will learn it, I mean Europeans. There is nothing to gain. You will carry this suitcase now. You will carry it. And Russia should stay as far as possible in this respect. But when we talk about the conflicts, don't put them into one basket. Look at each conflict separately. Let me give you one example. The first such conflict was Transnistria. What happened? Very briefly. A crowd of Romanian nationalists from Chisinau boards the cars more or less in the same way as ISIS now is going on Toyotas, and marches in front of Tiraspol, where General Lebed with his division is located. They shoot a little bit, they make a lot of noise, then appears General Lebed, those who remember how he looked like. I mean, you can frighten kids with him. And he says, "Basta." I'm going to give orders to shoot. And these guys retreat. And everybody thinks, oh, they have lost. Not at all. They have won. Because the whole purpose of this action was not to conquer Tiraspol. The whole purpose was to create exactly this situation which we have today. Because only separating Tiraspol in terms of the reservoir of people who will never vote for their parties, they could win elections in Chisinau. So not all such conflicts develop in the same way. Georgia, Ossetia is absolutely different story and so on. So yes, buffer zone in which sense? No expansion of NATO structures in this area. This is actually tragic in a sense that after 25 years, we have ended up in quite logical outcome because we have not created, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, we have not created new structures. What we did, we started to exchange, to extend this, all structures, be NATO for example, further east as a stabilizer, and it worked for some time, in some cases. But now we ended up in a situation when for Russia it is a red line. NATO should not be in Ukraine, for example, right? And who is going to stabilize Ukraine and how? Nobody knows. And what? It is a very particular sort of beer which is brewing there today.
Thank you. So that's now my slot for asking a question. The second one I had, you already have answered. What does your concept mean for Eastern Europe? So I think it's quite similar, and your answer was plus clear. Danilevsky, by the way, the book he mentioned lies out in the bookstores in Moscow. You can, it's reprinted and it's everywhere in the bookstore. So the reference to Danilevsky is quite widespread now among the intellectual elite, or the conservative elite in Russia. I am just wondering, is the concept of Greater Europe, or let's say the other Europe, Russia as the other Europe, as the better Europe, so more the Europe with more classic values of modernity, is this not a concept which is important, at least among the elite, and it plays, I'm asking because it plays an important role in the interaction between the far right in Europe and Russian parts of the elite? What do you think about that?
Well, there are three possible options in Russian society. One, I described to you, post-European Russia. Another is clearly hostile to my point of view and very persistently pro-European, which is there, which has been there for 25 years, which used to be dominant. Now politically it is marginal. The recent elections are very interesting, this Duma election, because the way these pro-European parties, which were allowed to join the process, lost, shows that it is not manipulation of Kremlin, believe me. It is not. It is just that they do not have any social base at all. And here we come to the third option. Other Europe, better Europe. I would say that it is default option for several sorts of people. Some people say, okay, it is clear that we are not going to be Europe of European Europe. But if we say that we are post-European, all the devils of the Russian soul and all of Russian history somehow wake up and get out. In my view, devils never sleep, and they will not wake up. They are here. We have simply to deal with them without this, camouflage of this strange concept. Because if you are other Europe, you are still sentenced to proving somebody that you are European. That is a kind of a mental illness of Russia. I think that the biggest problem that Russian racial type is European. And in this respect, it's not quite clear why we are not Europe. We are not, simply. Spending approximately half of my life in Europe and loving Europe very much, I'm telling you, Russia is not Europe and is not going to be. But it doesn't mean that it is a hostile force. You are not expecting Japanese to be Europe, right? But you do not see them as a threat. We can end up in a similar, quite healthy relationship.
That's all this for the future. Now, one final question. So then it's your turn, and then you can continue the talk with him, with our speaker, during a small Empfang auf Deutsch. Reception.
Okay, so my name is Dimitrios Moskos. I'm a student at the Institute of East European Studies. Professor Miller, thank you very much for your really interesting talk. You mentioned that the first enemy of the Bolsheviks were Russian nationalists. And it is known that also Bolsheviks used the nationalism card, but only in the context of oppressor versus oppressed nations discourse. And in that case, the Russians were the oppressors. Taking also into consideration how much time it took for ethnic Russians to get their own republic in the Soviet Union, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic that was created a bit later than the other ones. When would you say that this conflict, this enmity, stopped? And was it just a civil war phenomenon or something deeper? And if I may add a smaller one, did Andropov's plan include only ethnic administrative units inside Russia or the dismantling?
Well, starting with Andropov, he wanted the reorganization of the whole Soviet space into 49, for some reason, regions. Concerning your first question, Bolsheviks started to use Russian nationalism when it became an empty shell. At the moment when they realized that there is no potential rival political force behind them. If you are really interested in this, there is an article by Veljko Vujacic, who was a student of Ken Jowett, one of the most interesting sociologists who was dealing with Eastern Europe. And he has an article about exactly this. So that was similar to other Bolshevik treatment of other nationalisms. National identity was promoted, but there was always a kind of a axe in the hand, bourgeois nationalism. And bourgeois nationalism had to be destroyed. And that meant that from time to time you have massacres or purges of intellectual leadership of various national movements. For example, in Belarus, out of the whole union of writers in 1938, 5 people survived. 5 people, just 5 individuals. All the rest were massacred. Like 20% of the Union of Ukrainian Writers survived. And you have to study this. You have to study this story because you have this dramatic moment in 1922 when Stalin and Lenin, in letters to each other, discuss this construction of the future Soviet Union. And Lenin wants independent, quotation marks, republics with the right for secession. And Stalin says it's going to be very problematic. Lenin explains that don't worry, we have the United Communist Party, which is a glue. And Stalin says to this old and not intellectually well fit by that time man, these young communists, that is exact quotation, these young communists treat constitution seriously. And if we leave it as you suggest, we shall end up with a threat to the unity of the Communist Party within several years. And then Lenin forces his institutional solution, but who lives with this institutional solution is Stalin. And Stalin has his own means to solve problems. We all know what this means.